Hello, good morning, greetings, Earthlings. I'm back with another video, and I'm going to talk about writing again because I said I wanted to do more content about writing. Today, I'm going to be talking about some mistakes that you might make while you're writing, and I'm specifically talking about writing fiction because that's what I'm most acquainted with. That's what I'm best at. I almost entirely write fiction. I haven't written anything that's not fiction in over a year since I was obligated to for a grade. Anyway, I have notes in front of me, so if I look down, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at my notes to remind myself of what I need to say next. So hopefully this video will be more structured and more coherent than the last one, because in the last one, when I talked about the difference between planning a story versus not planning a story, it made no sense. I was all over the place. The first mistake is errors with dialogue. And I could make a whole nother video on this, and I will. I am promising you right here and right now, I will make a whole separate video just on dialogue mistakes. There are rules to writing dialogue, like grammatical rules, like how it's formatted and whatnot. But there's also just general stuff with writing dialogue for your characters. You don't want to make it all sound the same. You don't want your characters to all speak the same way because real life people don't work like that. And if you make all your characters sound the same, your readers aren't going to be able to tell anyone apart. Next up, bad characters. And by bad characters, I don't mean villains or antagonists. Those are necessary in many stories, if not most stories that are written. I mean characters that are either unrealistic or unlikable. You don't want characters that are either or both of those things. You want your characters to kind of feel like real people, even though they're obviously not. You don't want them to feel like flat pieces of cardboard because it's boring. If you're reading a story and you don't even like the characters, they don't feel real to you, you're not going to keep reading the story. You know, if your main characters are completely unlikable people, if they're all terrible people, I'm not going to want to read that story. I want someone I can root for. If your reader doesn't want to root for your main character, you have a problem and it needs to be fixed. Next, writing something you don't even like. Why? Why would you do that to yourself? If you're not enjoying writing it, why are you writing it? Just stop. Just write something that you think is fun to write. Because, trust me, it's kind of easy to tell the difference between a story that a writer genuinely enjoyed creating and putting their time and effort into, and one that someone just wrote because they felt like they had to, or they just didn't enjoy the process of it. So write something that you enjoy. Write something that you would want to read. That's a good general rule to follow. Not knowing what genre you're writing in. Pick a genre and stick to it, okay? It shouldn't be fantasy 1 second, and then realistic fiction another, and then it turns into a mystery halfway through. Don't do that. The only exception is if you're writing something that you're not planning to ever show to anybody, then it's fine. Who cares what happens? If you're not planning to put it out there or look for feedback or whatever, do whatever you want. But otherwise, you should write in a genre and stick to it. You can combine genres. It doesn't have to just be a single genre story. You can have an adventure fantasy. In fact, I have a feeling most fantasy stories probably also fall into adventure. You could have a horror sci-fi. I'm sure those are out there. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of them. Just look at the Alien movies. It was a movie first, right? I don't really know. I know there's a video game, but horror sci-fi, fantasy mystery, anything. Just, you can combine genres if you want. It's not a bad thing to do. In fact, it can be pretty cool. See what happens when you combine elements of two seemingly entirely different genres. It can be pretty fun. Unwarranted POV switching. This is called head hopping, and you don't want to do it. Absolutely, stories can have more than one POV character, and in fact, many stories do. Some only have one, and that's completely fine, but many stories out there, especially very popular ones, often have more than one POV character. So that's not the issue. The issue is switching the POV in the middle of a scene with absolutely no warning whatsoever. If you're gonna switch the point of view from one character to another, do it at the start of a new scene or the start of a new chapter. And at least have in the actual text formatting, have a break between the passages where the POV is switching so that it doesn't just go into a new paragraph and suddenly it's a whole new point of view, because the reader's going to be confused, everybody's going to be confused, you're going to be proofreading it and be confused, like, wait a second, this isn't right, something doesn't feel right here. So only switch POV when there's an obvious indication that POV has been switched. Don't switch POVs in the middle of a scene, that's a no-no. I see, don't do it. Sometimes it's possible to do it without even realizing. I've done it without realizing it, so, you know, it's important to proofread for that kind of thing. It's very, very easy to notice, very easy to catch a sudden POV switch that's not supposed to be there. Over-describing or under-describing. Both are possible, and both are things you do not, preferably, want to do. If you describe too much, you can bog down the story, it gets slowed down, it can get very boring and tedious to just read descriptions of things over and over. But if you don't describe enough, your readers might be confused and they'll be like, wait a minute, what's happening? I don't get it. I thought this was happening, and now this is happening? You get what I mean? It's hard to explain, and this is the sort of thing where if you're worried about it, it's best to have someone else take a look at your writing so that they can point out maybe where there's an issue. Like, you described too much here, you didn't describe enough there, because sometimes when you're, you know, getting the cycle of constantly looking at your own work, it can get difficult to find those mistakes in your own writing. Too much backstory or exposition. Please, for the love of God, do not info dump at any point in this story. Do not give, like, world-building information or backstory unless it becomes important and or relevant to the story and the characters and what's happening in that current moment. I once read a book in, like, 7th grade, I didn't choose to, I had to for the class that I was in, where the main character, the narrator, it was a first-person book, just dumped his backstory at the very beginning of the book. I think it was the prologue, where he was like, I was orphaned as a child and I was left to be raised in an orphanage, but it was horrible. And it's like, well, dude, you haven't even told me your name yet, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to give backstory for a character that readers, like, haven't even had a time or a chance to connect with yet, because they're gonna be like, why do I care about this? I don't even know who this person is yet. So don't info dump, don't put a whole bunch of exposition at any point in the story. Figure out where certain information is relevant and then explain it as it becomes relevant. Next up is bad plot twists, and by this I mean plot twists that are either too predictable or not predictable at all. There is a fine balance, and especially with good plot twists, it can be hard to find that balance between it's too predictable or it's not predictable at all. Because you don't want a plot twist that just comes out of nowhere. You don't want to have your readers just be like walking down, you know, the sidewalk in the neighborhood of your story, and then out of nowhere a train just comes barreling along down the road for some reason and just absolutely smash them across the street. You don't want that. You don't want plot twists that come out of nowhere. You don't want plot twists that leave the reader feeling like, wait a minute, but that doesn't make sense. You know, you don't want a plot twist that doesn't make sense. But you also don't want a plot twist that people can see from 400 pages earlier before it happens, right? So you need to leave clues that can start to seem like they connect, and the readers should be able to pick up on those clues and be like, I wonder if this is gonna happen. You know, like, they should be able to get the feeling that the clues that are being left are leading up to something. But you should also leave enough room for doubt. And some of the best plot twists are the ones that only make sense in retrospect. Like, as soon as it hits you, you're like, oh, that's what all that stuff meant. You know, that sort of thing. And another important thing to remember with plot twists is when you are writing a story and there is a plot twist in your story, it will seem predictable to you because you are the writer, you planned it out, you know how all the dots connect to each other, and you know how everything leads up to that plot twist. So if your writing seems overly predictable to you, that's normal, because obviously you wrote it, you know how everything happens. So, once again, it can be helpful to get someone else to read your writing for you and have them point out, like, this doesn't really make sense, or, I predicted this a bit too early, like that sort of thing. The next mistake is always writing like somebody else is going to see it. when you're constantly writing, like, you think inevitably one day someone is going to see what you're writing, it can make you feel really self-conscious about what you're writing, and it can really limit you in what you feel like you're comfortable with doing or what you're able to do. Not everything you write has to be seen by someone else, but it's okay to write something that you absolutely never plan on showing to anybody. You can write something just for yourself. It's totally fine to do that. It can be really fun to just have a little secret little story that you're like, this is for me and me alone. Nobody gets to see this. You know, it's like a little secret for yourself. And finally, the last mistake that you can make when you are writing is being afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You can't fix the mistakes in your writing if they aren't even there. You're going to make mistakes. Okay, listen to me. Look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you. You will make mistakes. Okay? And even when you go through your story 500,000 times, which is an unreasonable amount of times to edit and revise a story in the first place. But regardless, even when you're done with editing and revising a story, there's still going to be mistakes, okay? It's never going to be perfect. You're allowed to make mistakes. It's okay. No one's going to kill you for making mistakes. And if they do, that's on them. They're the one being unreasonable. But my point is, if you won't even let yourself make mistakes when you're writing, you're not going to get anywhere with your writing. You're not going to grow. You're not going to improve. Because one of the best things to do to improve your writing is to go through what you've written, find the mistakes that are in there, and come up with a way to fix them. Make mistakes. Go ahead. You have permission. I didn't need to give you permission. Nobody had to give you permission to make mistakes, but you have permission to make mistakes. Maybe don't do it on purpose, but just acknowledge the fact that when you go through something you've written later, you're gonna be like, there's some mistakes, and that's okay. You're allowed to make mistakes. And that's all the mistakes in writing that I wanted to talk about today. I'm sure there are many more. You can find plenty of articles and videos, yada yada, etc., whatnot, all about mistakes in writing, because they do happen. They're very common. Everybody makes mistakes. Nobody perfects their writing ever. That's all the mistakes I wanted to talk about. I hope this gave you maybe some insight into writing and mistakes and how to kind of figure out what mistakes are there. I'm saying the word mistakes a lot. Didn't write an outro. I don't even have a script. I just have notes. I'm horribly disorganized. Have a good day, and I will see you later. Goodbye.